You asked me with the kind of offhand innocence that only someone truly unaware of the weight behind their words can manage, not out of disrespect, but with the practical curiosity of someone trying to tidy up a home, unaware that they're brushing against a sealed chamber of memory. Can I donate this old jacket from the closet? And I stood there, not speaking, not moving, as something in me stirred in ways I hadn't allowed for years, maybe decades. My gaze drifted instinctively toward that old wooden closet, where the hinges groaned like they remembered more than I'd ever told, and in the dimness behind folded blankets and forgotten boxes, it lay there still, folded the exact same way I had left it, untouched, undissed, undismissed by time. The uniform. It was the last thing I wore before everything changed, not just my surroundings, not just my title or my status, but my soul itself. Because that day, I didn't just put on a soldier's uniform. I put on a second skin that absorbed everything I couldn't say out loud. The fear, the duty, the exhaustion, the unbearable silence that follows the deafening chaos of war. The fabric still smelled faintly of iron, of age, of something sharp and ancient, a scent not even 50 years of dust could quite cover, as if the threads had held on to the echoes of gunfire, whispered orders, blood, and prayers whispered into dirt. The collar frayed, the seams stiffened, and yet the weight it carried hadn't lightened at all, because it wasn't just made of fabric, it was stitched, shed with memory, with names of men who never made it home, with moments that rewrote the shape of my life without asking permission. You didn't mean to uncover all that. You were just looking to clear some space, maybe make a donation, maybe declutter a closet, but you opened something else entirely, something older and deeper, something I'd packed away not out of neglect, but because I didn't know what to do with the man I became in that uniform. For years, I convinced myself that silence was strength, that moving forward meant locking the past behind closed doors. But now I realize that silence isn't healing, it's waiting. And maybe, just maybe, your question, so simple and well-meant, was the invitation I didn't know I'd been hoping for. The quiet permission to finally open that door, to finally breathe out all the things I've held in for too long. So yes, there's a story behind that jacket, not a war story exactly, but a memory story, one about what it means to carry love, grief, hope, and guilt in your chest for a lifetime, and how a uniform in the back of a closet can be the last thread connecting you to the man you once were. If this story touched you the way it moved me to finally tell it, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing real stories that reach into the quiet corners of the heart. And now, stay with me, because what comes next will change everything. It was April of 1945, and the war was beginning to crumble at the edges, at least on paper, though no one in our unit dared to believe that anything was truly ending. Not while the earth still shook beneath our boots and the sky stayed thick with the threat of one more shell, one more ambush, one more final breath held a second too long. We were somewhere outside of Bologna, the kind of no man. His land that looked like it had been forgotten by time and mercy alike. And that morning, before we moved out, I put on the uniform for what I didn't know then would be the last time I'd wear it in battle. There was no ceremony in it, no quiet reflection, no moment of calm, just cold fingers fumbling over buttons, the stale scent of damp fabric from the night before, and boots stiff with dried mud that cracked like old leather. And yet, as I pulled the jacket over my shoulders, as I tucked the dog tags beneath the collar and laced up those heavy boots, I felt something settle into me, not confide. And easy, not courage, but something quieter, dignity maybe, or a kind of resigned steadiness, the kind that comes when you've run out of illusions but still have to march forward because stopping isn't an option. The collar was already worn thin from weather and wear and the weight of days that felt twice as long as they should have. My hands shook, not from fear exactly, but from exhaustion that lived deep in my bones and a knowing that today could be the day, because every day could. I'd lost friends, too many to count without choking on the numbers, lost part of my hearing from a mortar blast that hell. left my left ear ringing ever since. Lost the sense of time and purpose I used to carry so easily before the war made everything feel both too real and not real enough. But the uniform, that uniform, still gave me something solid to hold on to, something that wasn't about flags or speeches or medals, but about surviving, about making it home, or at least making sure someone else did, because after a while, that became the mission. Not winning, but getting through, getting back, getting anyone back. It was heavy on my body that day, but I needed that weight. It kept me tethered to the ground, kept my head from floating into places it couldn't afford to go. I remember how the fabric scraped against the bandage on my side, how the buttons stuck just slightly from dried sweat and rain, how the sleeves rolled unevenly because one of the seams had torn a week earlier and I'd stitched it myself. With medical thread, we made do, we always did, because there was no alternative, only forward, only now, only today. I remember one of the new guys, Thompson I think, asking me just before we moved if I really thought we were almost done, if the rumors were true that the Germans were breaking, that the war was winding down. And I looked at him, at his too young face and the way he held his rifle too tightly, like it could protect him from truth, and I said the only thing that felt real. Don't think about after, just get through today. We moved out under a grey sky, not yet raining, but promising it would, and every step we took felt like it could be the one to end us or carry us forward, and in that strange stillness between death and survival, that uniform became my shell, my mask, my last layer of identity, not the man I was before the war, but the one shaped by it, carved by its fire, stripped down to whatever was left aft. The fear and the hope had bled out. We didn't wear those uniforms for glory. By then, none of us believed in that. We wore them because they were the only thing holding us together, the only skin we had left in a world that no longer made space for softness. They carried our dirt, our blood, our silence, and still asked nothing in return. That night, when we came back with fewer men than we'd left with, I took the uniform off slowly, folded it carefully, as if rough hands might undo the only thing still intact in me. I didn't know then that it would be the last time I wore it into battle, but something in me suspected it, because the way I looked at it, the way I touched the collar, traced the seams, felt like saying goodbye to a piece of clothing, but to a version of myself I wasn't sure would ever come back. It's strange how something so small, so seemingly insignificant to anyone else, can become the very thing that holds you together when everything else is falling apart. And for me, that something lived in the inside pocket of my uniform, folded so many times it had softened at the edges, stained slightly with sweat and time, but still intact, still there, still whispering the same few words I add every night before closing my eyes. Come back if you can, and if you can't, think of me until the end. She'd written it in pencil, probably in a hurry, on a scrap of school paper, the kind with faint blue lines and a red margin, the kind kids used to doodle on in the back row of class. And though it had been years since the graphite had first touched the page, I swear I could still see the pressure of her hand in the strokes, still feel the moment she passed it to me, eyes full of the kind of hoe people only have before a war tears through everything they believe in. It wasn't long, it wasn't poetic, it wasn't anything people write in books, but it was real, and maybe that's why I couldn't let it go. In the early days, I used to unfold it slowly, reverently, like a prayer I was afraid to rush. I'd smooth out the creases with my fingertips, read the words over and over, not because I didn't remember them, but because something about seeing them with my own eyes reminded me that she had been real, that there had been a time before the smoke and the mud and the endless tension in my spine, and that somewhere beyond the mountains and gunfire, someone was waiting or had waited, or had at least once believed I might come back. But as the war dragged on and the noise became normal, as days blurred into weeks and friends disappeared with barely a sound, the letter changed. Or maybe I did. It became less of a message and more of a tether, a fragile line I held onto in the dark, not because I believed I'd reach the other side, but because it kept me from floating away entirely. It was something to press into my chest worse. And I was crouched in a trench to feel under my fingers when the ground shook with artillery, to remind me that before I became whatever this version of me was, I had been a man with a name, with a heartbeat, with someone waiting at home. There were times I was too afraid to read it, not because I feared losing it, but because the reminder of love, of softness, was too much to carry on top of the rifle, the helmet, the dead weight of silence that surrounded us after the noise stopped. Because there were days when just knowing the note existed, safely tucked against my body, was all I could manage, and anything more would have broken me in ways no bullet could. I remember one day, I don't recall exactly where we were, maybe somewhere near Ravenna. I was hit by shrapnel, a hot, sharp, tearing sensation down my side that left me breathless and stunned. And as I hit the ground, I didn't reach for my wound, didn't cry out, didn't pray. I reached for my pocket, for the paper, for the proof that something in me still mattered. And when I woke up in a field, hospital with stitches in my ribs and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, the first thing I asked wasn't about my leg or the war or who else made it back. It was, "Did you find my jacket?" Because I needed to know the note was still there, because I needed to know that not everything had been lost. After the war, when the flags came out and people cheered and music played in the streets, I went home with that uniform folded under my arm like a second skin I didn't know how to take off, and while others burned theirs or stuffed them in trunks or gave them away to forget, I couldn't bring myself to part with it, because that uniform with its torn seams and faded patches wasn't just cloth. It was memory, grief, survival, and the last remaining link to the man I had been before everything broke. I washed it once by hand in a small plastic tub behind my mother's house. I remember the water turning murky with dirt and time, the scent of sweat and rust rising like ghosts. I laid it in the sun to dry, smoothed the wrinkles, and folded it carefully, placing the note right back into the pocket where it had always belonged, because I couldn't bear to separate them, as if the paper and the J. Eckert had fused together in those months and years, holding each other in the same way they had held me. And it wasn't just the note. There were other things in those pockets too, things small and unremarkable to anyone else, but monumental to me. A rusted button from a buddy's coat who didn't make it past February, a small photograph of my mother with a note on the back in her tight cursive, a pocket knife dull with overuse, a broken chain with a tarnished cross that a nurse in Naples pressed into my palm with a look that said more than words ever could. Each item a fragment of something larger, a remnant of meaning in a world that had taught me how easily things and people can disappear. Those pockets, once just utilitarian, had become a kind of sacred space, a mobile altar of remembrance, stitched with pain and resilience, a place where I could reach in and feel not the past, but the parts of myself I hadn't yet buried. And for years I left that uniform untouched, folded and still, because I knew that to open it, to reach back into those pockets, would be to open a door I was, and ready to walk through. But even in silence, I knew what was inside. I knew the weight of it, knew the shape of the paper, the curve of the chain, the worn texture of the fabric that had rested against my skin in the worst nights of my life. And though I didn't speak of it, though I never told anyone what I kept in those pockets, the memory of them never left me. Because they weren't just objects, they were everything I had left. Coming home wasn't what I thought it would be. Though to be honest, I don't know anymore what I thought it was supposed to feel like. Maybe I'd imagined some version of normalcy, of quiet meals and familiar streets, of walking into a room and being the same man who'd left it, even after everything, even after what I'd seen and done and carried back with me. But the truth was that nothing looked the same. Not the town, not the people, and certainly not the man staring back at me from the bathroom mirror each morning, with eyes that had grown older and quieter in ways no one around me seemed to notice. They welcomed us with banners and brass bands, flags waving on Main Street like we were heroes, And I remember standing there in my issued uniform, hands at my sides, trying to remember what it felt like to want to smile. But it didn't come, because in that moment I didn't feel like a hero or a son or even a man returning from war. I felt like a stranger dropped into a movie where our actors still believed in the script, while I had long since lost the plot. I moved back into my mother's house for a while, the same one I'd grown up in, though even that felt different. The wallpaper was older, the floorboards creaked more than I remembered, and the room that once held my boyhood dreams now felt too small, too clean, too quiet. I kept the uniform in the same closet where I'd once hung my Sunday clothes, folded neatly, hidden behind winter coats and blankets that still smelled like the house I'd left behind. I didn't look at it often, but I always knew it was there, just as I always knew that a part of me had never really made it home. The silence became my second skin. I wore it to the diner, to work, to church, even around friends who asked questions with good intentions but never waited for full answers. I got used to nodding, to smiling in small doses, to changing the subject when conversation drifted too close to Europe, or gunfire, or those months that didn't fit neatly into polite conversation. I told people I was just happy to be back, and they believed me. Because it was easier than digging into the truth, easier than explaining that sometimes I woke up gasping for breath, thinking I was still in that field hospital, still bleeding, still counting names in my head, like prayers I'd forgotten how to finish. I found work at a local high school teaching math. Numbers made sense in a way that people no longer did. They followed rules, predictable, clean, no blood, no ambiguity. And every day I stood in front of a chalkboard filled with equations. I felt just distant enough from the world that I could function without unraveling. The kids were kind, mostly. Some were curious, asked questions about what it was like, but I always kept my answers brief, my tone neutral, my eyes on the floor. Because how do you explain to someone who's never left the safety of home what it's like to carry the smell of burnt earth in your nostrils for years, or how the sound of a door slamming can still send your heart racing like you're under attack? She wasn't there when I came back. The girl who wrote the note, I never found out exactly what happened, only fragments passed through small-town gossip and half-truths whispered over fences. That she'd moved west, maybe to California, maybe to Colorado, maybe to France, of all places, that she'd gotten married or hadn't, that she'd waited for a time and then stopped. I didn't chase the story, didn't write, didn't ask, not because I didn't want to know, but because part of me needed her to stay in the version I kept in my memory, untouched by time or disappointment. In my mind, she was still sitting at that kitchen table, still sliding that note across to me with hands that didn't tremble, still believing in something neither of us could name. I never married. There were women, kind ones, some who reminded me of her and some who didn't, some who tried to understand the silences and some who filled them with their own. But I never gave anyone the full story, never let anyone into the part of me that still felt stitched together by fear and memory and that note in my closet. And maybe that was selfish, maybe even cowardly. But I had already lived a life that required too much courage, and I didn't know how to be vulnerable in a world that asked me to smile and move on. The uniform followed me from place to place as the years passed, from my mother's house to a small apartment near the school, then later to a modest home I bought with a VA loan. Each time I moved, it was the first thing I packed and the last thing I unpacked, folded gently, always with the note still in the inner pocket. Not once did I consider throwing it out, not because I thought I'd wear it again, but because getting rid of it felt like erasing the only physical proof that the war had happened, that I had survived it, that I had once carried something too heavy for words. I never talked about the note, never showed it to anyone, never said her name again aloud. It wasn't shame exactly, or secrecy. It was preservation, a way to keep something sacred from being touched by the ordinary erosion of time and explanation. Because once you start telling the story, it becomes something else, something public. And I wasn't sure I was ready to share it with a world that had long since moved on. So I lived my life in patterns: early mornings, school bells, coffee at the same diner, walks through the park where the trees changed, but the silence stayed the same. And through it all, the uniform remained in the closet, its weight unchanged, its presence a quiet echo of the version of me I'd once been, and perhaps still was, tucked away behind layers of time and expectation. I didn't need to see it to feel it. I just needed to know it was there. It was a question asked without malice, without hesitation, and without any idea what it would stir inside me. A question tossed into the air like any other during a weekend of cleaning and reorganizing, as we shifted boxes and sorted shelves, as you tried to make space in a home that had long since stopped changing. And I heard your voice from the hallway, casual and cheerful, the way someone might ask about tossing out an old pair of shoes. "Hey, Grandpa, can I give away this old uniform in the closet?" And in that instant, time folded in on itself. The sound of your voice became the sound of her voice. The hallway became the trenches. The closet became a sealed chamber of memory breaking open from the inside. And I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't yet find the words to carry the weight that had just shifted inside me. You didn't know, of course. How could you? To you, it was just an old garment, stiff with time, out of place in a closet filled with seasonal coats and retired shoes. But for me, that uniform was a body, a witness, a keeper of names and nights I never spoke of. And in that moment, when you reached for it with the easy innocence of someone born long after the noise had stopped, I felt something inside me, something old, something long due, begin to uncoil like a breath I hadn't let out in decades. I walked to the closet, slowly, my hand already knowing which side of the hanger to grab, my feet already remembering where they'd always stood when I reached for it, though I hadn't touched the uniform in years. And when I opened the door, the scent hit me first. That faint, dry mix of dust and old wool, of sealed-in time and memory, a scent I hadn't noticed in ages but recognized immediately, as though it had been waiting for me, patiently, in the dark. There it was, still folded the same way I had left it, the buttons dull with time, the seams slightly puckered where they had been repaired, the collar worn thin with use. And I lifted it into my hands as carefully as if it were a relic. Because to me it was, not because of the cloth or the cut or the insignia stitched to the sleeve, but because of what lived in its pockets and what had once lay inside its frame. You stood nearby, quiet now, watching, sensing something had shifted, though you couldn't have known what, and I turned the jacket over in my hands, not quite believing it still weighed the same, not quite believing my fingers still knew its every crease and fold. And then, slowly, I reached into the inner pocket, the one over the heart, and pulled out a single folded note, the same one that did never left that spot, not through war, not through silence, not through years of not knowing what to do with it. I unfolded it carefully, as if even now it might disintegrate. The pencil had faded, the edges had softened, the paper had thinned, but the words were still there. "Come back if you can, and if you can't, think of me until the end." And I saw your eyes when you read it, wide with questions, soft with a kind of quiet respect, and I knew I owed you something more than the silence I had offered for so long. So I sat down on the edge of the bed, the jacket still in my lap, the note still in my hand, and I began to speak, not as I had rehearsed it in my mind, not as a story with a clear beginning or an easy end, but in fragments that stitched themselves together as they came, in memories that surfaced like photographs, pulled from water, blurry at the edges but undeniable. I told you about the field outside Bologna, about the cold, about the mud that never quite left our boots, about the nights we didn't speak, and the names I still carry in my head. I told you about the letter, how I read it every night, how it became more than a note, how it became a promise and a lifeline and a part of me I never let go. I told you about her. Not everything, but enough. How I never found her again. How maybe that was by choice, maybe by fear, maybe by the kind of quiet understanding that lives between two people who know there are some things better left in memory. You listened without interrupting, and that, more than anything, broke me open, because in that stillness, in your willingness to receive not just the facts, but the weight of them, I felt something lift, not vanish, not disappear, but loosen. Like the first breath after a long winter, like the sound of a door creaking open in a house that's been shut for too long. When I finished, you didn't say much. You didn't need to. Instead, you picked up the jacket from my lap, ran your hand across the frayed cuff, and asked if we could frame it. Not as decoration, not as a trophy, but as something that mattered, as something that deserved to be seen. And for the first time in my life, I said yes without hesitation. That night I couldn't sleep, not from pain, not from nightmares, but from the strange, unfamiliar quiet inside my chest, the kind of peace that only comes when a burden you've carried alone for too long finally finds a home in someone else's understanding. And I sat there in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and the jacket hanging on a chair, and I looked at it the way I used to look at photographs, with gratitude, with longing, with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with memory. I had feared for years that I would die, and no one would know, not just what I did, but who I was, that the weight I carried would vanish with me, that the story would go untold. But now it doesn't feel like that anymore. Now the closet is open, and so am I. Now the uniform no longer lives in the dark, folded and forgotten, behind old winter coats and sealed memories. It hangs behind glass, gently lit by the afternoon sun that pours through the front window, resting against the soft grain of a wooden frame we picked out together. The same one you insisted should be simple, respectful, and not too polished, just like the man who once wore it and leaked. The life it held within its seams. Below it there's a small brass plate, not a medal, not a citation, just words you chose after hearing mine, and it reads, "He came back." Not as a hero, not as a symbol, not even as someone who needed to be remembered by the world, but as someone who carried the past with dignity, who survived not just the war but the silence that followed it, who came back to tell the truth when the world no longer asked the question. It's strange how something so ordinary, cloth, buttons, thread, can become a monument, not because of what it is, but because of what it witnessed, what it absorbed, and who it carried. That uniform saw me through the worst parts of myself, and now it stands as a quiet witness to the man I became when I finally stopped pretending none of it mattered. You know the story now. You know about the pocket, the letter, the girl who disappeared into memory, the nights I didn't sleep, the mornings I woke up afraid of nothing and everything. You know what it cost to come back, what it meant to wear that jacket, what it means to fold it, to hold it, to keep it close long after the danger was gone. And maybe one day you'll tell someone else, maybe your children, or maybe a stranger who stops to ask what the framed uniform means. And maybe you'll say, "It belonged to my grandfather." And maybe you'll say, "It's not just a uniform, it's a story." And in that moment, without even realizing it, you'll be carrying it too. Not the weight of it, but the truth of it. I once believed I'd have to carry all of this alone, that to speak of it would be to cheapen it, that the silence was a form of respect, that my grief and memory had no place in a world that had long since turned the page. But I was wrong. Because what I see now, in your eyes, in your stillness, in the way you touch the glass without smudging it, is that silence doesn't preserve things. It buries them, and stories like people need air to stay alive. This isn't about war, not really. It's about memory. It's about love, the kind that's written on notebook paper and tucked into a jacket for 1,000 miles, the kind that survives absence, silence, and even time. It's about returning, not just to a place, but to yourself. So yes, I wore that uniform in battle. And yes, it was the last one. But now, more than that, it's the first thing that ever made me feel truly seen. And maybe that's the only kind of legacy that matters. We share new stories every day, real stories that move, inspire, and connect us across generations.